Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our webinar today, Exploratory Testing and JIRA. My name is Jeff Perkins. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer at QASymphony. I'm going to be your host today for this webinar. We thank you for joining us. A couple items before we get started. I just want to be clear on how you need to watch this webinar. The audio for this webinar is delivered through your computer, so there's no dial-in number. You just need either to turn up your speakers or use a set of headphones. Now, if your audio quality is choppy, it's probably because of your internet connection. We are actually talking through a landline phone here, so we're patched in through audio, so it wouldn't be on our end. So we would recommend that either you maybe get closer to the wireless router in your office, or hardwire into an Ethernet cord to maximize your connection. You can actually customize your webinar viewing experience here. All of the little widgets you see on your screen here are all customizable, so you can move them around. You could minimize them if you want to. And what a lot of people like to do is actually to enlarge the size of the presentation screen. So feel free to customize the experience you want. Probably the most important widget up here is the Q&A widget. We are going to take questions at the end of the webinar, so please, if you have a question, submit it there, and we'll be monitoring them throughout the webinar, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the webinar. So I want to just introduce you quickly to QASymphony. QASymphony, we are the creator of a test management platform that's built for agile teams. So if you'd like to get more information about our company and our services, I'd encourage you to go to QASymphony.com and take a look. I also want to tell you about another webinar that I think you might be interested in coming up on June 16th. The title for this webinar is Going Agile, Don't Forget About Testing. And this is going to be a great one. It's with our friends from over at Gallup Solutions and with our own Kevin Dunn. So please, if you want to, you can register for that webinar. And actually, if you look in the console here, in the upper right, we put a resources section, and there's a link to register for this webinar right there. So if you think this is an interesting topic while you're watching this webinar, you can go and register for our next one. So check that one out. So I'll tell you a little bit about our presenter today. Kyle McMeekin, he's a senior product specialist here at QASymphony. He focuses his time on customer demos and working with customers on technical support issues. He previously spent his time as a tester at Cognizant and is a recent transplant to our Atlanta office coming from the Washington, D.C. area. Kyle's a graduate of University of Michigan and is looking forward to seeing them win a national title at some point in the near future. So I will hand it over to Kyle in 1 minute. Just a few final housekeeping items. This webinar will be recorded. So following the webinar, you'll get an email from us with a link to watch the on-demand recording or to share the on-demand recording with your colleagues if you want it. We will be live tweeting during the webinar, so use the hashtag Exploratory Testing if you want to join the conversation on Twitter. You could also ask your questions on Twitter. We'll be monitoring the Twitter feed throughout the webinar. And at the end of the survey, you'll be asked to take, at the end of the webinar, you'll be asked to take a short survey. So if you stick around to the end, please make sure to take that survey. It just lets us know how we're doing with these webinars and lets us kind of figure out what we want to serve up for the next webinar. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Kyle to take you through exploratory testing. Kyle, go ahead.
All right. Thanks very much, Jeff, for that introduction, and thanks to everyone on the webinar today for joining. My name is Kyle McMeekin, one of the senior product specialists over here at QASymphony. So the agenda for today is going to cover exploratory testing in JIRA, right? So what are some of JIRA's suggestions around exploratory testing, the do's and don'ts? We'll then talk about some of the problems with traditional testing. How does that stack up as you're moving more towards agile from a development standpoint? What are some of the issues that come up with the traditional testing approach? Finally, we'll go in and actually dive into what is and is not exploratory testing. So we'll take a look at a couple examples and a couple of thoughts from some key leaders in the space. And then finally, we'll finish this up with discovering and mentioning some tools that can be utilized for exploratory testing efforts. So before we begin here, quick question for everyone here just to get an understanding of the current test management software that you all are utilizing. So if you take a couple minutes here, maybe just actually 30 seconds or so, feel free to go in and answer the poll question and survey, and we'll take a look at these results here in just a moment. All right, so we'll go ahead and move along to the results here to get an understanding of this. Seems like a lot of JIRA here, still some Excel as well, QTEST, HP, and Rally, and some other ones in addition to that. So it seems like a pretty good blend mentioned here, which is great to see. In addition to that, our final question here, I promise, will just be around exploratory testing and specific. So, as of now, is exploratory testing currently a part of your overall testing strategy? We'll take another few seconds here and get this addressed as well. All right. Great to see here as well. So yeah, as we can see, it tends the majority of the individuals on the webinar today are utilizing exploratory testing, which is great. We'll talk about how that can be utilized further, and for some of those that are looking to get established with it, what are some key takeaways and to move forward with implementing ET within your organization. All right, appreciate the responses there. So what we'll do now is let's first start off about JIRA and exploratory testing. So this first slide here is meant to be a representation of how many defects are actually typically found during the life cycle of an application. So all the way through the alpha stages into the beta, then ultimately on to the further iterations, we can see that there's an awfully high number of defects actually that are found initially, and it isn't actually until the third or fourth release where we're really seeing quite a significant drop here. So some of these articles that you can reference at the bottom, great resources. Atlassian and JIRA in particular, being thought leaders in the space, have a lot of good insights around where exploratory testing can be leveraged. And they do note, typically as your product is growing, your testing is going to expand exponentially as well. And of course, being in QA, as I have experienced myself, we tend to get the bottom edge of that. So really what we're looking to get at here is kind of understand and come to a consensus that there are some other methodologies and approaches you could take from a testing perspective to really speed up how quickly you're able to accomplish the different testing that you are doing. So on top of that, right, Atlassian will also recommend that your exploratory testing should be product focused. So being a tester, being familiarized with the product, you should have a firm understanding of the ins and outs of that product, how it works, where it doesn't, and we'll talk about how exploratory testing can be leveraged and how it differs from that of traditional testing when it comes down to focusing in on your product. Another thought that JIRA and Atlassian will provide, and as mentioned before, is that a lot of the times issues with exploratory testing come around documentation. So what are you actually doing? Could you actually provide test evidence, whether it's test evidence for exploratory tests that you've done, or you're looking at a way to further report on defects or issues you find even during UAT testing, right? How are you doing that? And typically what we would see is that individuals would do some sort of print screen, post that into Paint, perhaps then formulate a Word document or email draft that they would then store locally or perhaps send off to a developer to show their test evidence. And really there's going to be actually an emergence of tools that can do all of this for you, and we'll talk about some of those tools later on towards the end of our session here today. And then finally, Atlassian will also make the point that exploratory testing is not just for testers. They actually would encourage developers to get involved and be a part of the quality process as well. So opposed to just throwing it over to the wall from development onwards to the QA individuals, this would actually be a collective effort, and by incorporating other team members aside from just the QA folks into the testing process, it actually will help ensure that the developers are writing more clean, robust code from the get-go, so we can look to reduce the amount of defects that we are finding up front, opposed to having those be reduced more and more towards as a product matures and we continue to develop against it. So just some quick findings around exploratory testing. You can check out the case study here below. But on average, and what we've actually seen is that it's actually 7 times faster than doing this traditionally with perhaps scripted tests that you're accustomed to. So we'll talk about how this can speed up the time savings here. In addition to the amount of time that's saved, there's actually more bugs that have been discovered, right? So, and we'll go into reasons behind this, right? It's not just a very A to B type approach. There could be a multiple of ways to achieve some end result. We'll talk about some strategies around that, but from what we've discovered here, that you'll actually be finding more bugs through exploratory testing opposed to the traditional approach. And then finally, just from an accuracy standpoint, so we also have discovered that through testing through the traditional way, there's actually more defects that are raised that actually turn out to be false defects. So with an exploratory testing approach, utilizing proper tool sets and processes, it will really help identify from an accuracy standpoint how well your test coverage is going and really relaying back the appropriate information to the development team. So with that kind of laid out here, let's go in and talk about maybe some of the shortcomings of traditional testing. So I'd encourage you all to check out some of those reference links I provided by Atlassian in the prior slides. I mean, those are fantastic resources, and a lot of what we are discussing today about problems with traditional testing and the upsides of exploratory testing are pulled from various thought leaders in the space, and we'll be sure to have a reference section towards them at the end. But I'd also, of course, encourage you to utilize Atlassian's resources and articles to learn more about the upsides of this. So let's get into it and talk a little bit about what are some of the problems with traditional testing, right? So with the traditional testing approach, we'll keep in mind that these are typically tests that are written out beforehand, right? So you're going through step by step and you're being told this is what you should be doing, this is what you should be expecting to see, and you work your way through those steps. And what we tend to see happen is that you're actually, those predefined steps can actually cloud your interactions with the software that you are testing. So you're doing a very structured process through these interactions. You're just going from one point to another without much deviation, and you're consistently kind of just testing the same thing without deviating from the path here. In addition to that, right, you're going to be focusing a lot on documentation. So how is this certain step performing? What am I seeing here? And you're really honing in on documenting what you're doing opposed to critically and cognitively thinking about what you're actually testing. So we'll talk about how some tools here can help actually take care of the documentation for you and allow you as a tester to focus in on what you should be doing, which is testing. And then on top of that, right, there tends to be very siloed approaches when it comes to collaborating with customers. So we'll talk with exploratory testing how you can, as a tester, work with the business, work with developers very closely, and actually even spread ideas between testers to identify different ways you've gone about a test session opposed to the traditional approach where every tester, right, on your team, if they're running the same test case over and over again, is doing the exact same steps. And we'll talk about how collaboration can increase, communication can increase through an exploratory-based approach. And then on top of that, just the misconception of kind of just test plans, right? So test plans being generated thinking it's going to be the end-all, be-all. If we follow this test plan, we will be great. We will capture all the bugs, and we will capture them the first time around. So typically with the traditional-based approach, it's going to be more straight and narrow, right, in that regard. So it's going to be an approach where, you're laying out steps A to B, and you're going to have tasks in between there to accomplish those. And that tends to create a tunnel vision effect, right? You're not checking the blinders for additional avenues to explore, and we'll go into that here in just a moment. And then on top of that, some additional problems around it, right? It's just ultimately somewhat boring from a manual-based approach. It's very repetitive. You're going to be following the steps as they've been defined to you, whereas from an exploratory standpoint, you do have an objective in mind, right? And there might be multiple ways that you can ultimately cover that. You could try multiple tasks and various combinations and different routes, and all of that will ultimately bubble around and lasso in the objectives that you want to accomplish. So that are some of the problems that you may or may not have experienced personally with traditional testing. And now we'll kind of shift gears here and talk more so about what can exploratory testing provide, right? What exactly is it, and what are some of the value gains that we can get? So we'll break this down into 5 different sections. So for starters, exploratory testing is going to be parallel in nature. So instead of just having, a test plan developed, then designing our test cases, and then executing, we're going to do all of these in unison with one another, and we'll talk about this here. It's going to be specific, but it's also going to be flexible. So yes, there are going to be specific objectives that you're trying to accomplish. You're not going in just blindly clicking around trying to identify bugs at random, right? There is going to be an objective in mind. However, it's going to be flexible enough to allow you to adjust and change course without having to follow some rigored process all the way through. In addition to that, it's going to be aligned towards investigation of opportunities. So it's going to allow you as a tester to explore, to investigate, to use your cognitive abilities to ultimately drive and discover maybe underlying bugs that you would not normally find through a traditional based approach, or allow you more freedom when it comes to testing so you can utilize some of your product knowledge to drive forward quality. And then on top of that, it's going to really allow you kind of to running with that to really focus in on the details. We talked a lot about the documentation process that goes with traditional testing, right? How you're focusing more so on documentation and opposed to maybe exactly what you should really be testing. And that coupled with the knowledge sharing aspect of it and the accountability aspect of it as well. Working with other team members, bouncing ideas off one another of how they've gone about testing certain features or pieces of the software would enable, not only the accountability amongst team members, but it will also help ensure that everyone's on the same page moving forward when it comes to quality. So starting with number 1 here about doing the planning, designing, and execution all in parallel, right? From a traditional standpoint, we talked about how you're initially doing your test plan, you're then creating test cases, you're then executing, and then you have some reporting that goes alongside that, right? This is actually, through an exploratory test, going to be extremely flexible in this approach, right? So you actually might be planning one of your exploratory runs and actually then, immediately running in to execute that. And ultimately, you're going to be doing all these things in unison opposed to an iterative type fashion, right? So what this will ultimately allow you to do is be more flexible in your approach, where if you do go in and perhaps you are planning, let's say, to access or test out a new piece of functionality like the creation of a user account, you might be able to go through and your design phase will not necessarily be predetermined, right? You're not going to have to go through and list out all the steps one by one prior to going in and perhaps trying to log in with different length passwords or including some special characters in the password field but not others. So you'll be able to kind of deviate from the ultimate design aspect of it, and this would allow you to execute these sessions freely and ultimately, through the tools we'll talk about towards the end, easily report out on those to provide test case coverage and include that within your quality-based reports. The other topic we talked about here was that we do have specific avenues that we want to explore and address during our test sessions, right? And exploratory testing should be specific, but it should also be flexible. So one of the analogies we like to use here is that traditional testing is more along the lines of a train on railroad tracks, right? Let's pretend we're going from Washington, D.C. up to New York. We're jumping on a train, and we're going to get from point A to point B. Whereas, exploratory testing, yes, we're going to get from point A to point B, but we're going to be allowed to deviate. Maybe we take a different route to get there. Maybe we switch tracks if we notice something isn't right. So we'd like to take that approach from an exploratory standpoint. So yes, New York is going to be our objective, our end goal there, but there's many ways that we can ultimately achieve and get to that state. And what this really helps with is allowing you to be flexible in the sense that, hey, what if we had a test plan, if we were testing traditionally, and halfway through we realized this just isn't working. It's almost too late at that point, right? You're already so far along, you're going to stick it out, but really the results aren't going to be what you want. Whereas with the example here through our little Waze application, you're really testing this as an end user would. Maybe I'm not going to take this direct approach to create a user account. Maybe I'm going to go about doing that in a different way entirely. So yes, the objective will remain. You will still want to achieve some sort of end testing result, but there's going to be multiple ways in which you can achieve that objective here. And then what this will also allow you to do, we talked about investigating opportunities. So again, using the same analogy with the train tracks, from a traditional standpoint, if you're going from Washington to New York, you're probably following one route up there. It's not going to deviate as much. You can think of exploratory testing as more so of using an application like Waze. Perhaps you're going to take I-95 north and there's an accident. So Waze will suggest another route around that you could explore and investigate that maybe you wouldn't traditionally do is if you only had one option, right? So really what this would allow you to do is discover and really hone in on things you might not have. Maybe you've now passed a restaurant that you never would have seen because you took a different route. Or you passed by a natural park of sorts, right? So these same kind of concepts apply in a testing approach, right? So quality isn't just going to be driven by getting from point A to point B in one way. You can imagine as an end user, there's thousands of different ways at times that you could achieve the same desired end-based result. So exploratory testing really facilitates and encourages testers to really investigate what other bugs can you find that maybe are not covered by a scripted based test, right? What is some of your product knowledge that you're using? And even for those situations in where you're entirely new to the product. So I'm a new tester. I'm not familiar, with how this product works. I would envision that's almost the same as an end user, right? You might actually be doing similar actions and taking similar courses of action as an end user of your product would be. So even for all different types of skilled levels of their testers, whether they're junior level, whether they're intermediate or more senior level testers, I really think exploratory testing would allow these individuals to explore other avenues that they might not otherwise be able to do so with a traditional based approach. Great. Now on top of that, we talked about exploratory testing fostering knowledge sharing, right? So as we go through and we're doing all of these things in parallel, it's important to not only, test, run our test sessions, report out on them, but also transfer this learning to other team members. So I would find it very difficult, at least from my experience, from a traditional testing approach, to go through perhaps a manual test case and just read comments, perhaps that were left by individuals that ran them before me. There doesn't tend to be a lot of knowledge transfer here. We'll talk about some suggestions here that really can be utilized to help transfer what you've learned during an exploratory session and kind of debrief and share that with other team members, with management, with developers, and other members involved in the SDLC process. So a couple of common questions you can ask yourself, right? Have you seen this before? Did you come across this same issue? What am I not considering? What are some potential ways that you actually ran through this test to achieve the end result compared to what I've done here? And then, that kind of goes along the lines of why would you do this as well, right? What would be, is this the desired functionality that we're expecting here? Is this how we're expecting our end users to utilize the product? So a lot of this debriefing, and there's different forms and different thoughts around what type of metrics or, reporting you should do after an exploratory session, and we will discuss that here in a few slides. But really, the exploratory testing should foster kind of a knowledge repository where you are communicating your test efforts with fellow team members, both senior and junior level, and really helping kind of drive quality from, of course, a test standpoint, but also as well as relaying information back to the development team. So ideally, sticking with our amazing Waze example here, right? So just bring it all together, right? Let's say we are going to shop for different cars, and on the left side, we have our traditional approach where we start off and we're just going to go around the block and ultimately, try out our new vehicle, right? So there's one way we did that. We went around in a very simple manner, whereas on the right side, you can imagine that as more of an exploratory run, right? Maybe we go through a couple side streets or a couple different avenues, and we're really testing more. Maybe some of these avenues are of gravel, others are on dirt, some are on pavement. So there's really just different situations that we're going to be able to discover by not having a predefined set of test steps immediately available to us. And I can really envision this kind of helping with the speed of testing, right? It's not going to be as mundane as simply going through a very repetitive task day in and day out. You're going to be able to find more defects. You're going to be more aware and excited about actually what you're doing, because it's kind of up to you to investigate, to find bugs, and find different use cases that end users might actually take up. So we've discussed a lot about what exploratory testing is. A couple of myths and things that it isn't are some things that I would like to address next. So what exploratory testing is not is it's not unstructured. So a lot of times we'll hear pushback, and there's many articles out there that will discuss how exploratory testing is just people going in and randomly clicking around, right, trying to find bugs and trying to find corner cases in the software that would expose kind of a gotcha to the developer, right? That's not what exploratory testing is. I mean, it should be very structured. There should be an objective in mind. In 2 slides here, we're going to talk about different debriefs that you could run as an exploratory tester, right, and information that you can provide to your team and to your business. And then, as Atlassian refers to a lot as well, they do make some great points that exploratory testing is not the only type of testing. So it's not just the one thing that you should be doing. This can be coupled with other tests that you're running, your manual tests, automation-based tests, if you're doing any continuous delivery or continuous integration tests, right? These are all different types of tests that ultimately satisfy the quality aspect of software, right? So it is by no means an end-all, be-all type approach. I would advise that it's something that's just incorporated into your existing testing efforts and something that can be leveraged for UAT reasons and for the traditional base testing approach. And then in addition to that, we talked about it not being unstructured here. So what exactly are some of the parameters that would align to create a successful exploratory-based test session? I think the goal of the session should be laid out up front, right? So prior to you going into an application or starting up, a tool to capture your exploratory efforts, what are you trying to get out of this, right? What persona am I taking here? Am I an end user going in to test the application? Am I going to be an admin that's going in to test the application? So these personas and these goals and objectives should be defined prior to you just running in and launching a session at will. So there is more structure behind it, more thought that goes into it during those planning and designing phases prior to execution. It's not just immediately going in and running through that. And then in addition to that, this kind of talks about how to really structure this. So one of the common themes here would be like something similar to a session report. So for each session that you're running, right, what exactly was the mission statement? So we talked about your goal here. What were you hoping to accomplish during this? You could provide information like your name and when did you start it, how long did it last, what were some of the tasks that you looked to break down? Did you test the login functionality? Did you test adding a product to your cart and checking out, right? What were some of the task breakdowns that you look to accomplish during that? From a data file standpoint, right? What type of inputs were you creating during your session, right? If you were logging in, were you using your username, or were you using the email, were you using different password lengths to test this? And then ultimately some notes, issues, and bugs that you found along the way. And we'll talk about a couple tools here in a bit. JIRA Capture, some of you might be familiar with. We have some other ones as well. Really powerful tools that help kind of guide and do a lot of this documentation for you, and ultimately you could leverage these to build out these types of reports as well. And then finally here, we'll also talk, a little bit about, an example of this. So we talked about what exactly did you do. This is another thought of how you could structure your different reports after an exploratory run is completed, right? So it's by no means this is the template you should use. You could use various templates here. I mean, the idea is that you want to make these sessions transferable, right, from a knowledge standpoint, like we discussed earlier on. So one of the common things is Jonathan Bach here. He's a very great thought leader in the space. I'd encourage you guys to check out his blog. We'll have a link towards that at the end here. He came up with the proof model. So this is really to help with that debrief, right? So what happened during your session, right? What exactly did you see? What obstacles kind of interfered with your ability to conduct a very thorough run? What is left there to do, right? Did you only get to a certain piece of the functionality? Do you think there's other ways in which this could be tested, other avenues that you can investigate? And then ultimately, how did you feel about it? Was it productive? Were you able to run along and find additional insights into things that you perhaps weren't getting through your predefined scripts here? Okay. And then kind of running along the lines of Atlassian's recommendations, when they were talking about getting their developers involved, right, with exploratory testing as well. It's not just for testers. This also sheds some light on how it could be used for UAT testing. So a lot of the times UAT testing would be done by a SME, a subject matter expert of sorts, kind of in a hybrid role between a business analyst and working with the developers. So with a lot of product knowledge, but also working the business side of things as well. There can be a lot of challenges for UAT. I mean, typically there's not a lot of time left to do it, right? So it often can get skipped or it's very crammed in order to get done. And a lot of things that you have to consider is that individuals that conduct UAT testing, that is very likely not their day-to-day job. So they are unfamiliar with, hey, what type of environment details do I need to include here? Should I be capturing this screenshot? How do I document what I'm doing, or is this important to the developer? So exploratory testing and the tools that we'll present here will allow folks, UAT testers in specific, to really just focus in on their product and the business flows that they know and let the tools do the capturing for them. In addition to that, they're likely not trained on test case management tools. So a lot of you mentioned you're using different products at the beginning, some HP, some QTEST, some JIRA, some other solutions as well. UAT testers might not be as aware of the inner workings of these tools and the different workflows that can be within them. So if they can actually lean on a tool to do all the proper documentation and really reduce the amount of time that they'd probably have to spend within those platforms, that would be a huge upside as well. And then in addition to that, we talked about the UAT testers perhaps not testing 6 to 8 hours a day. So, of course, with exploratory, we talked about some of the gains in efficiency and the amount of bugs that can be discovered. This would allow UAT testers to really kind of deviate and kind of veer off from maybe going through, let's say, dozens of manual test cases to achieve and accomplish their UAT, right? It would, again, allow them to take advantage of their workflows, their business workflows, and product domain knowledge to really test the application to the best of their ability. And then, of course, the short period of time. I think that's applicable to all testers, but UAT typically comes towards the end as is. So a lot of their time is going to be, we could dedicate that towards exploratory testing opposed to being overburdened down with the manual-based scripts that are sent to them. So I think really the main takeaway here is that exploratory testing does have its upsides, in particular increasing job satisfaction, right? So it's going in and actually feeling like you can be a part of discovering a very hidden bug or providing thorough test evidence without being overburdened by documentation. And ultimately, it will help you get more familiar with the product as well, right? By thinking cognitively and critically through your test sessions that you're doing, you're not simply just going through a predefined checklist and mindlessly going through and clicking on buttons to complete a manual-based script, right? You can use and gain product knowledge and ultimately get a firmer understanding of the solution that's being delivered out to the customer base. So with that in mind, I think what we'll do now, we'll talk about some tools for the job. So one thing we'll do is one more question here. So I guess I lied when I said we only had one left. We have one more. What kind of tools do you currently use to document either your exploratory testing sessions or defects you find? So even if you're not doing exploratory testing, how do you relay defects to a developer or to your manager? We'll give you a few seconds now and answer that. All right, so we'll let those results come in In the meantime, let's take a look at our first solution that could be leveraged for exploratory testing. This is called JIRA Capture. So this is actually a product by Atlassian. It's an amazing product. It's able to capture all of your screenshots during a session that you conduct. So you can very easily and fluidly annotate on the fly, so you can add in all sorts of call-outs. You would be able to add in text annotations, add in all types of editable features, and this will allow you, of course, to capture any type of web-based session or application that you're running on, and then you can actually submit these exploratory sessions directly into JIRA. So you could actually have one of these sessions satisfy a particular user story, right? So maybe that user story is no longer satisfied by a manual script, but you have a very thorough, powerful exploratory run that you do, and you want to associate it to a given story or issue in JIRA. JIRA Capture would be a very great tool for you to do that. So on top of that, let's go ahead and look at our results here before we talk about some other solutions as well. Snagit is a very popular one for screenshot capturing, JIRA Capture. Some of you might be aware of that, which we just went over. And then, of course, the old print screen. That's what I used to do as well. And then some other ones in there as well. So that's good to hear. One other solution that we'll throw out there is going to be the QTEST Explorer tool. So this is something that QASymphony offers for exploratory testing. It can be used for UAT efforts or even just documenting what you're doing. So this tool can actually be run on any sort of device. So we have this available for like desktop applications, including some of your legacy-based ones you might have in-house. You could utilize this for web apps, for mobile applications that you guys are developing natively, iOS and Android. This would be applicable there. And what this would allow you to do is in a similar sense, annotate on the fly, capture everything that you're doing during an exploratory or UAT based run, and all of these sessions that you conduct would be stored back in our platform. So you could easily go in and review them, but ultimately takes away the need, as does JIRA Capture, to manually capture screenshots. And both of these tools will provide you with a platform where you can review your sessions. You can go in and see exactly what was run and what type of data was inputted and where users were clicking. And through Explorer as well, I should also note that you can submit these directly into JIRA. So if you're using JIRA for your defect tracking, right, you could actually submit an exploratory session from Explorer directly into that tool and provide the developers with all the environment details and all the test session metrics here. So just a couple thoughts on some tools. Of course, there's other ones out there as well. Snagit's another one that's very popular from a screen capture perspective. And in addition, of course, to the print screen as well, which I'm quite familiar with. So, I just want to give a little shout out here to some of the thought leaders in the space. We went through the Box, James and Jonathan Box. Those are two brothers, very good thought leaders here, and I encourage you guys to go learn more. These have been extremely helpful for my own educational purposes, as well as a few team members here. So I want to give a big shout out to Atlassian as well, providing some very thorough content and thoughts around the exploratory testing space and how teams can look to incorporate that into their testing practices. So with that said, I think we'll leave some time for a little bit of Q&A here. We see some questions coming through, so feel free to keep those coming. We'll get those addressed. If not now, then we will be sure to send some follow-ups as well.
Great, thanks, Kyle. A lot of questions in here, so we'll try to get to as many as we can. A lot of activity on Twitter as well, so follow that hashtag exploratory testing to keep the conversation going. So Kyle, the first question, I'll actually take this question because it did come in from Twitter. Exploratory testing makes sense for UI, but any experience in doing it with document-centric process tests?
Document-centric process tests. All right, so I'll take that as when you're working more so based off like perhaps documents you're verifying or maybe applications that are not UI focused. So yeah, that is a challenge. I'd say that it can certainly still be done. I still think the same principles would apply to that, even if the tooling capabilities, right, like Explorer or Snagit or JIRA Capture here maybe not be leveraged to capture maybe some like more back-end based processes or things that are kind of running behind the scenes, but I do think the same approach can still be taken, right? So instead of having those steps predefined and certain steps laid out, could you perhaps incorporate these different sessions or charters or take on different personas to test those types of applications? I still think that's certainly something that could be done, and would still allow for the facilitation of communication and knowledge sharing and all of that we discussed today.
Great. We had a lot of questions about automation and that kind of balance between exploratory testing and automation, and can exploratory testing be automated to some extent? I mean, what are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, I think there needs to be a healthy mixture there of automation-based tests and exploratory runs you do. I know that there are, at least at QASymphony, we are working to help automate perhaps some of those exploratory runs that you conduct, right? So could you actually run an exploratory session and then convert that into a Selenium automation run? So I think, we're moving there as an industry and as a company. That'd be obviously something that'd be very ideal. Instead of someone running through an exploratory session over and over again, perhaps in different ways, could you actually automate those existing base sessions? And I think that's something that we'll certainly see here in a couple months, perhaps. And then, of course, keeping the healthy blend of the automation intermingled with exploratory runs is of course, extremely positive, at least in my eyes.
Great. So this question is, how do you measure the percent complete or the coverage using, when you're doing exploratory testing versus traditional testing?
Yeah, that's a great question as well, and I really think it comes down to what's the end goal here. Is the end goal to understand metrics just from a reporting standpoint? So, hey, we have these requirements, we have 5 test cases tied to them, we've run through all 5 test cases, so we're at 100%. I think those metrics are important, but I would also think it would be equally as important as, what if you were able to, let's say, use JIRA Capture, run through an exploratory session, and link that to a story? I would almost be, consider running a report against that as adequate test case coverage. So you would be able to identify for all the stories you have, do they, have test cases, perhaps manual-based ones tied to them, and how well have those been progressing? I think that aggregated with of equal importance is, hey, does this perhaps user story is satisfied by an exploratory run? Would we now consider this done since we do have test evidence here? So yeah, I think it really just depends what you're ultimately looking to get out of that, but I do think an aggregation of both those approaches would allow you to get an understanding of how well, ideally, testing has been progressing and actually the whole SDLC opposed to just, pass-fail rates.
This is an interesting one. In companies that are in kind of regulated industries where there's a lot of, there are compliance issues, this question said exploratory testing doesn't necessarily fit into those industries. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, so we get that a lot, and we have Kevin Dunn's a great thought leader in this space as well, and I think there's a lot of misconception around exploratory testing cannot be done in a regulated space, and I think some of the concern around that is just because it's very hard at times or without the proper tooling to actually have an audit trail essentially on that test evidence trail. So with different tools, Snagit, Capture, JIRA Capture, even our Explorer tool, you can actually have these sessions that you run all be archived. You can easily access them, and then you can link the sessions that you run to requirements. So if those are, the issues, I still think the similar approach would stand, that you could utilize exploratory efforts and methodologies to satisfy the requirement and still make that association for traceability reasons. That is something that I know you can do through the QTEST platform at least, and through JIRA Capture as well.
What about mobile applications? What are people doing today for exploratory testing when it comes to mobile?
Yeah, so there are exploratory testing tools. QTEST Explorer, like we mentioned, is available on iOS and Android devices. So those can actually record the different swipes you take on a mobile application, the different pinches, the different taps you mark up, and actually record all of that in a similar way that would be done through a .NET or desktop-based app. So yes, we are seeing a lot of organizations, of course, develop mobile applications for their consumers, but we still think, or at least I believe, that exploratory testing with the proper tooling can easily be done just as seamlessly on mobile devices as it could be on a desktop or more traditional-based application.
Great. We had just a bunch of questions on terminology. What's the difference between exploratory testing and ad hoc testing, UAT? Do you just want to refresh people on that again?
Yeah, so UAT testing will be user acceptance testing. I almost would think, UAT testing as a whole can be traditional in its approach, scripted. So when I'm mentioning scripted based, I would consider that manual, right? So you have predefined the script that you're going to follow. I would loop in ad hoc, unscripted, all into the realm of exploratory, right? It's not, you don't have predefined steps for you. So I think that would be the distinction I would make there. Then as far as UAT testing goes, that could be manual or scripted in nature. In the same sense, it could also be unscripted in nature and more exploratory. So that's how I would kind of distinguish those. So anytime I hear ad hoc or exploratory based, I'm thinking through exploratory testing, whereas scripted would be more along the lines of a manual, predefined steps that you have established.
All right, great. And I just want to remind everyone, we're coming up to the end of the webinar. We're going to have a survey that pops up once the webinar ends, so please take that. A couple more questions for you, Kyle. What kind of tester is required to do the exploratory testing? Or is a tester even required? Should other people within the organization, should the developers, should the project managers be doing the testing?
Yeah, I would say through my time in the area and the industry, as well as some of the thoughts through the Atlassian references that I've read up on, is that it really should be a collective effort. I think that bubbles down to more along the lines of, is QA the only team responsible for quality? And for that, I would say no. So I would say it would be really beneficial to get developers, perhaps even if they're not the ones doing the exploratory testing themselves. There's a thing known as pairwise testing. You could join up a QA individual with a developer and run through an exploratory run. The developer is going to know how it works from the code side. You're going to know how it works from the user side of things, and I think that's a really powerful approach. So I think it could really be utilized for any type of individual involved in the quality process, and I wouldn't restrict that to just QA.
The next question was, are there any best practices you've seen on the debrief that you talked about? Like, how do you really effectively debrief with with the people doing the exploratory testing?
Yep. So there's all types of templates that you could create. That proof model or acronym that we went over is a great foundation for that. So this could be a document that you perhaps output some of maybe your sessions from the QTEST Explorer tool or from perhaps JIRA Capture into. But really it's just more of setting up a process, right? So, as we mentioned, I would say one of the dangers of it is that when it's not, easily adapted is because people don't really follow the process that's in place when it comes to actually doing these debriefs. So when it comes time to, hey, what exactly did you test and how did you test it? If you don't have that documentation, I don't think that would fly with a manager or with an auditor. So I just think it's important to establish what works well for you, right? If you have a little debrief and break it up into, what was your goal of the session? What did you learn? What is there still left to do? I think that's a great start for building out kind of those debriefs and knowledge transfer documents there.
Great. Well, everybody, thank you for joining us today. Kyle, thank you. We did get a lot of questions we couldn't get to. We'll try to respond to you individually. And we did see some technical questions in regard to using QTEST Explorer, so we will reach out to you if you did submit those questions. But again, thank you for joining us. Check out our next webinar coming up in June, and stick around and fill out the survey. Help us rate this webinar. Thanks, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.